Joe loved trains. He'd loved them since he was little, and it was a love affair that had lasted a lifetime. He had gotten his first train set when he was 5 years old, and though the models he had now were as different from that set as he was from the child he had been, he still remembered it fondly. His train set in the basement of the home he shared with his wife and daughter, and the table he had set up were so big that it took up nearly half the floor space. His wife often bemoaned how much room it ate up, but he ignored her for the most part. He paid the bills, he slaved away at work so his wife and daughter could live comfortably, and when he got home, all he really wanted to do was relax with his trains. He had a little cap he wore and a special pair of overalls, and he sat and listened to the trains chug along, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him anywhere else in life. He would sit down here for hours sometimes, just playing with his trains and letting life pass him by. He could hear his wife, Debbie, moving around upstairs, but he put her out of his mind too. Debbie would call down to let him know that dinner was ready, and then he'd have to leave his cap on the hook and go upstairs and spend time with his family. His family. Ugh, they were so dull. His wife would ask him about his day, a day that had been boring and monotonous and would be better forgotten in the basement with his trains. Jennifer would talk about cheerleading or some boy she liked, and Joe would pick at his food as he listened to nothing but the clickety-clack of train wheels in his mind. He was dreading hearing her come down the stairs, consoling himself by watching the trains go by. That's when he noticed the house for the first time. The house had been purchased at a hobby store 2 towns over. His wife had complained when he had told her where he was going to get the things he needed for his train set, but it really couldn't be helped. The hobby shop in town was not the sort that stocked train things. The greasy man behind the counter, the one wearing the Led Zeppelin t-shirt and a shiny ponytail, had pushed his glasses up his nose and informed Joe that unless he were here to play Warhammer, they did not stock models for that sort of hobby. So, Joe had gone 2 towns over to find a man who carried his sort of hobby. He had gotten about 5 little wooden houses for his diorama that day, but it was only now that he realized one of them looked a lot like his house. He hadn't painted them, they had come just as they were, but as he watched his trains chug around the place, he could see that one of them was a white house with a tan roof and a picket fence that went all the way around it. Joe didn't remember having seen it before, but as the train came around to pass it, he found his attention suddenly pulled to it. It was like a scene in a movie where the shot zoomed in on a certain object, and Joe felt his eyes drawn there inexorably. The house was sitting next to the tracks, and whoever might take in the breeze in the evening on the front porch would have a great view of the trains as they went by. In fact, he thought he saw someone leaning on the windowsill doing just that. There couldn't be anyone doing that. Joe hadn't put any people in any of the houses, but he saw someone nonetheless. He couldn't make the fellow out. He was like a giant trying to see a passing sparrow. But the longer he stared, the more familiar the man looked. As the train rolled past and kicked its water vapor smoke into the air, he imagined that he could see someone watching it wistfully. Joe put it out of his mind, swapping his CB steamliner for a larger diesel engine, and went back to enjoying the trains. Even so, as they continued to rumble around the track, he was drawn back to that house again and again. The man leaned on the sill and watched the locos as Joe swapped out trains. Was he a man? Joe felt certain that he was. He was still leaning there, watching the trains roll past with fascination, when Debbie called down to tell him that dinner was ready. Joe glanced at the stairs, momentarily drawn out of his daze, but when he looked back at the little man, he was gone. Maybe his wife had called him to dinner too, Joe thought with a snort as he put his hat on the hook and climbed the stairs. He'd have plenty of time after dinner to search for him again as he ran his trains on their endless courses through the landscape that he had created. And Martha said that her daughter got accepted into Ohio State. After all that bragging about getting into Dartmouth, her daughter couldn't get any higher than our own little state college. It just goes to show you what bragging gets you." Joe was plowing absent-mindedly through his mashed potatoes as Debbie prattled on about some friend of hers whose daughter was apparently too dumb to get into her college of choice. Ohio State was a fine college. Joe had gone to Ohio State to get his degree in engineering, but he didn't feel like saying as much. If he just agreed with her and let her get it out of her system, then she'd likely let him get back to his basement so he could play with his trains. He glanced over at his daughter, Jessica, and saw that she was attached to her phone as usual. She didn't have time for much else these days, and between TikTok and Instagram, she barely seemed to be in the world. She had no time for her parents, just her friends and her fans. Joe didn't really care. He was no better if he thought about it, and her attention to the phone meant that he had more time with his trains. And then she said she might make her daughter wait a year so she can take the entrance exam to Dartmouth again. Can you imagine having such a stagger between high school and college? You would... "Can I be excused?" Jessica asked suddenly. "Diana wants to go live in a few minutes." "Jessica, you've barely touched your vegetables," Debbie lamented, but Jessica was already getting up and leaving. Me too," said Joe, taking his plate to the sink, his vegetables noticeably gone. Debbie pursed her lips as the two of them made their hasty way to their various hobbies. "Sure, why not? I only cooked the dinner, but I suppose I'll do the dishes, too." Neither of them were listening, though. Joe was heading downstairs, Jessica taking the stairs to the second floor 2 at a time, and Debbie was left sitting at the table. She wanted to cry. She wanted to rage at them, but she picked up her phone instead. She had a message there, a message that made her smile. And soon her absentee family was as far from her mind as Martha or her dummykin's daughter. The trains thundered over the plastic track, making their way through the little town that Joe had built for them. He could have as many as 5 trains going simultaneously on this setup, if he wanted to. As long as he kept his eyes on the switching times, they would never run afoul of each other. In the beginning, Joe had been afraid to run more than 2 at once, but now he was comfortable enough to run as many as he wanted. He could run 5 without even thinking about it, and that made him feel proud somehow. It was a silly thing to feel proud of, but he found that he did. And why shouldn't you feel proud? The rail line sure can't run itself, came a voice from the model below. Joe jumped a little, looking around to see who was talking. He looked at the steps, but there was no one there. He stood up, his chair making a harsh noise as he did, but as he looked across the basement, he couldn't find anyone there either. The voice hadn't been very loud, like a voice from outside, and he looked up to the little window near the top to see if someone was peeking in on him. "Down here, hoss," came a voice from the model, and he looked down to see someone sitting on the porch of the house that had looked a lot like his. He didn't remember putting a rocking chair on that porch, but as he watched, it went back and forth, and a tiny little man watched the trains roll by. Joe leaned down, coughing as one of the trains belched smoke as it went by, and as he looked, he saw the weathered face and overalls of an old man. He looked like a farmer, what his dad would have called a corn husker, and he had a little pipe in his mouth that was making its own smoke. Joe leaned down beside the house, and if the man was bothered by the presence of a giant man looming over him, he never showed it. "About time you noticed me. I've been waiting." Joe was speechless for a moment, trying to figure out a sense to the sudden arrival of this miniature man. Who are you?" he finally settled on. "Me? Why, I'm Bill Williams, remember?" Joe furrowed his brow. He didn't, but the name did sound familiar. The old man laughed. "Don't tell me you forgot your own town of Macklin. You built it, after all." Joe nodded. He had thought of the little town here as Macklin, named after the little town that he had grown up in, but he didn't think he had ever actually written anything down to christen it so. Come to think of it, the house here was where he had decided that Bill Williams would live. It was something he had been thinking about as he planned to put down mailboxes outside the homes, and this was the house that he had planned to set the Williamsons' box outside of. Joe nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess I had been planning to flesh the town out some. And not a moment too soon. We were feeling a little two-dimensional down here. Fred was just saying the other day. Fred? Joe asked. Bill cocked a finger at the house next door. Yes, sir, Fred Murphy. He's only lived here since his folks passed a couple years ago, but we're real fond of him. He got his leg blown off in Korea, but he's got one of them new prosthetic legs, and he gets around just fine. As he said it, a little guy came out of the house next door and wished his wife a fond farewell. He had a pretty noticeable limp, but Bill was right. It didn't slow him down in the least bit as he went down the steps and climbed into a little blue Datsun Matchbox car that Joe had glued into place there. To Joe's further surprise, he started the car up and drove off down the road. It sure was swell of his old man to leave him the hardware store down on 5th Street. Fred does a swell job of running it now, and we all thank him for it. The blue Datsun took its time as it went from the little red house beside Bill's to the hardware store about 3 streets over. Joe had made it from a kit that he'd picked up at Walmart around Christmas time, but as Fred climbed out and stumped towards the festive cardboard building, Joe thought it looked far more three-dimensional than he remembered. He'd been so busy focusing on Fred and his shiny blue car that he jumped a little as the post truck drove by, and a hand came out of the window to put mail in the box. Right on time. Letter carrier Loretta is always so punctual. We were sure sad to see Charlie retire, but Loretta has been a great mail lady in his absence. Her daughter just got into Ohio State. Did you know that? We're all so proud of her. It's quite a school. Joe was practically kneeling beside the table as it all came to light before his very eyes. His trains weren't the only thing moving suddenly, and he saw people going to the shops and driving their cars over the streets. A little bell rang as a group of kids left the schoolhouse, heading for home. Some people went into the department store he had built on Main Street, while a few others went to the bank. There were homes to go back to, dinners to eat, TVs to watch, and Joe seemed to be master over all of it as he watched it all stretch out before him. Bill knew them all, every story, every home, and he regaled Joe with countless tales of their lives. Joe, for his part, was enthralled. He sat listening to Bill as the sun began to set outside the little window above his head, and when it became too dark to see, he reached up to pull the light cord, almost absent-mindedly. The Christmas lights he had strung above the model twinkled like stars, and Joe saw headlights wink on as people made their way home or out for other activities. When his wife called to tell him that she was going to bed and ask if he meant to stay down there with his trains all night, Joe realized it was nearly 10 o'clock. He had spent all afternoon down here talking to Bill about the little town he had made out of cardboard and model kits, and now he needed to get some shut-eye. Needed to, but didn't really want to. Land sakes, Bill said, checking his watch. I gotta get to bed. Sorry, Hoss, but we'll have to continue this some other time. Tomorrow, maybe, he said, and Joe thought he looked almost as hopeful as Joe was. Of course, Joe said hurriedly. I'll come down right after work. Sounds like a plan to me. See you tomorrow, Joe, Bill said. He went into his house, and Joe reached up to turn the lights off before deciding to leave them on. Let the little people enjoy the stars tonight. Joe couldn't honestly remember a better week in his life. It had been hard to sleep that first night, his mind all a tizzy with the concept of a whole city in his basement, but he had finally managed to drop off. He had blown through his work the next day, finding joy in tasks that had been nothing but mundane until then, and he had finished early that day. He'd come home while his wife was out buying groceries and went straight to the basement to talk to Bill. The little man knew everyone in town, and Joe was so engrossed in his stories that his wife had come halfway down the stairs before he even heard her. "You're home early," she said almost hopefully. "Yeah, I got done with my stuff early, so they said I could go," Joe said. They stood staring at each other as the smile slipped off her face. She had clearly been hoping that he had come home early to surprise her, but it was becoming apparent that he had come home early to play with his trains. Joe couldn't understand her sudden interest or the increasing slip back towards this interest. She had expected something, maybe? Had he forgotten something, like a birthday or an anniversary? He was bad at remembering those. Joe often found it hard to relate to people. He sometimes wondered why Debbie had agreed to marry him at all, but he believed that she had once found these things endearing in him. Joe wasn't sure what had changed, but it wasn't him. Well, I'll just leave you to it. Dinner should be ready in a little while. I'll call you. She went back upstairs, the door closing a little harder than it strictly needed to when she got to the top. Wonder what that's about, Bill asked. Joe had only shrugged, and the rest of the week had gone by much the same. If Debbie seemed more distant than usual, Joe hadn't noticed. If she spent more time on her phone, what of it? Jessica spent most of her time on the phone. Maybe Debbie had found something to do on her phone, too. He spent most of his time in the basement talking to Bill as he learned about the fascinating history of the town and its people. The longer they talked, the more real the town seemed. The buildings took on definition. The cardboard surfaces became three-dimensional. The pictures on the outside seemed to grow, the barrels and bicycles and signs they bore, and the whole town came to life before his eyes. Before Joe knew it, it was Sunday, and he was sitting in the basement with Bill having a beer. Joe, we're friends, aren't we? Bill asked suddenly. Joe nodded, not having to give much thought to it. Yeah, Bill, I'd say we are. And friends tell people things they suspect might change their lives, don't they? Joe nodded a little slower, not sure where this was going. Well, Joe, they say a man's home is his castle, and I believe your wife is trying to invite a dirty rascal into your castle. Joe's eyebrows knit together. What you mean, Bill? I mean, your wife was down here doing laundry a couple of days ago, and she was talking to somebody on the phone. Conversation was getting, shall we say, a little spicy. And I thought to myself, good for Joe. He deserves a little something extra. But when she called the fella by name, the name wasn't Joe. This guy's name was Simon, and it seems your old lady is really taken with him. Joe wasn't sure how to process this. Why would Debbie cheat on him in the first place? He paid the bills, maintained the insurance, kept the cars up, fixed the house when it needed it, and paid a handyman when he couldn't fix it. He did all the things that were expected of him, and if she felt uncared for, why hadn't she said something? Bill, Joe said, not really sure what to say. Are you sure? I think I am, Joe. Think you may need to get your house in order. Now, I say this as your friend, Joe, but it ain't right for a woman to run around on a man like that. She needs to be corrected, Joseph. She needs to be reminded who's in charge around here. Joe shuddered as he took a sip of his beer. No one had called him Joseph in a long time. The only person who called him Joseph was his father, and he was dead and in the ground. The name felt like footsteps on his grave, and he wasn't sure he liked it. Joe perked up his ears as he heard footsteps overhead, the clank of plates as they were set out, drawing him back to reality. Sounds like dinner's ready. I should go, Bill. Debbie will be expecting me. Sure, Bill said. Man needs his victuals. Come back when you can, Joe. I'm not going anywhere. Joe went slowly up the stairs, watching the model get smaller and smaller as he climbed. He wasn't sure he would be back after dinner. Joe might have lost his taste for trains. Just a little bit. Joe grimaced as he ate the hamburger helper. Joe hated hamburger helper. The noodles were always mushy, the cheese always tasted funny, and there was just something unnatural about the concoction. It really wasn't a fit meal for Sunday dinner anyway. Debbie usually made ham or burgers or something with some substance. He would be hungry again in no time after a meal like this. Jessica was picking at her food, but Debbie's was still untouched. She was glued to her phone, texting someone, and by the look on her face, she was enjoying the conversation. There was a look there that Joe had never seen before, not even when they were dating, but it was a look he knew. It was that sultry look that women sometimes got when they were talking to someone they liked, maybe even liked a lot. "I might go see some friends after dinner," Debbie said, taking up her plate and dumping the cooling lump back into the pan. "You guys may have to fend for yourself for bedtime." Jessica shrugged. "Sounds good. Have fun, Mom." She didn't even bother to look at Joe. Debbie just went upstairs to get ready, leaving him to take care of cleanup. He was still scrubbing when she left, and when he asked when she would be back, Debbie just said not to wait up. Joe couldn't help but notice she was wearing her favorite dress, the black one without sleeves, and that this was usually a date night outfit. It had been a while since they'd had a date night, not since her birthday a few months ago, but Joe recognized the dress. He finished the scrubbing and grabbed another beer, heading for the basement again. He needed to talk to someone, and Jessica certainly wasn't going to be any help in this situation. The following week was so different from the one before it that Joe almost felt like he had whiplash. Debbie went out almost every night, and when she was in, she was glued to her phone. She took her phone calls outside or upstairs in her room these days, and he had noticed some new clothes hanging on the closet door. You would have said this would be great. Joe left to his own devices to pursue his interests, but something had changed after Bill had told him about his suspicions. He didn't suddenly find himself afraid of losing Debbie. This wasn't a Hallmark movie, but he did worry about how this would change his routine. Suddenly, the prospects of not having as much disposable income, of having dinner late, or his responsibility, or having to worry about clean clothes and dishes in the sink, was a real problem. Then, of course, there was the little voice whispering in his ear as he sat in the basement, contemplating his situation. "She's making a fool out of you, Joseph, strutting around with someone else, probably already in his bed and violating her wedding vows. She's putting cuckold's horns on you, and that ain't right." Joe drank his nightly beer, the bottles becoming plural as the week went on, and thought about what Bill was saying. It's impossible," Joe said at first. "Why would she do such a thing? I'm a great provider. She'd have no reason to go looking for someone else." Bill had snorted. "Who knows, Joseph? Sometimes women are just unreasonable. They feel like what they have isn't good enough, so they go looking for something on the side. Who can say what's going through her head?" Joe didn't want to believe it, but he was slowly beginning to come around. As he and Bill sat and listened to the trains run and the town thrive, Joe wished he could go live in Macklin himself. Life in Macklin looked simple, and Joe could use something simple right now. His life had become very complicated as of late, and he wanted to return to something more wholesome, a place where wives and daughters honored their father for his sacrifice, and dinner was on the table when he got home, a place where people were satisfied with their lot. By Thursday, Joe was certain that his comfortable life was coming unraveled. He came down in the same clothes he'd gone to work in, not feeling like dressing in his conductor's overalls much these days, and found Bill sitting with Fred on the porch as the two smoked their cigarettes. They had been talking quietly as he came down, but they looked up and waved as he noticed them. "Got some bad news, Joe," Bill said, taking a long drag off his cigarette before letting the smoke out like some kind of a wrinkled dragon. "Your old lady had a friend over to the house today." This was news to Joe, since Debbie hadn't been here when he'd come home. He'd found the breakfast dishes in the sink, the clothes still on the line, and his wife gone off somewhere. Joe told himself that she was getting things for dinner, but who knows? Was she out with friends, or just one friend? He didn't know that either, but he was beginning to suspect it was just the one friend now. "How can you be sure?" Joe asked, not wanting to believe it. Shoot, Joseph, you could hear 'em carrying on up there. I'd imagine there's a few loose springs in your bed these days. Then they left again, and then you came home about an hour later." Joe sat down heavily, trying to make sense of all of it. This can't be happening. I refuse to believe this is happening," Joe said, putting his face in his hands as he rested his head on the table. "Afraid it is, hoss," Bill said, taking another long drag off his cigarette. "I'm just glad my Millie never strayed like this. Think we both know what would have to happen if she did, don't we?" he said, he and Frank nodding in unison. Joe opened his fingers as he turned his head. What would have to happen? "Well, let's just say there'd be a fresh plot in the backyard if my old lady tried to step out on me like that." Joe was silent for a few seconds, seeming to weigh Bill's words as he thought about what he was saying. I could never do anything like that." Bill gave him a hard look, no mean feat for someone with eyes that small, before shrugging. "Nah, I guess not. I guess we're just cut from different cloth, hoss." Joe went back upstairs, the basement suddenly not seeming so inviting. The house above was quiet. Jessica hadn't come home, spending the night with a friend, and Debbie was still out. Joe went to the kitchen to see if there was anything to eat, but most of it looked less than appetizing. In the end, he just sat there as night fell outside, his stomach grumbling and his anger rising. Who was Debbie out there with? Had she actually brought them to the house? He wondered briefly if what Bill was telling him was real, if the little people of his train town were real, but the thought wouldn't hold. Of course they were real. They spoke to him, and he had seen them with his own eyes. Joe wasn't imaginative enough to create something like that from whole cloth. Joe liked trains, he liked to build, but he wasn't delusional. The idea that this might be some kind of psychotic break never even occurred to him. In his mind, everything was ordered, and Joe had everything in its proper place. The headlights of Debbie's car slid across him as she pulled into the driveway. He heard her come up the walk, heard her keys slide into the lock, and as she came in, he watched her take her shoes off before coming inside. She was creeping in like a kid out past curfew, and when she saw him lurking in the dark living room, she jumped and screamed, dropping her shoes. "Jesus, Joe," she said, putting her hand to her chest. You scared me to death." Joe didn't say anything, just watched her as she bent down to collect her shoes. "Were you expecting dinner? Sorry, I went out with some of the girls. I figured you could manage for yourself for a night." She was smiling. All smiles was his Debbie, but when he didn't say anything or get up to follow her, she sighed and rolled her eyes. "Are you mad or something? It was just one meal. It's not like you pay me any attention when I'm here anyway. Figured you'd be thrilled to have the house to yourself. Just you and your trains." She stood looking at him for a count of 12, but Joe really couldn't think of anything to say. "Fine, be that way," she said dismissively. "I'm going to bed. Good night." As she went up, Joe began to feel a little guilty about thinking she might be stepping out on him. He'd been paranoid. Surely it was nothing. She had a good life here, but it seemed it was getting a little mundane for her. She just wanted to go out more and do some fun things. Joe was a bit of a homebody. Maybe it wasn't the worst thing in the world if he had to cook a meal for himself now and then. As the stair light came on, though, Joe saw something that made him rethink. He had been on the verge of rising, meaning to apologize for being weird, when he saw a purple mark on her neck. It wasn't huge, wasn't ghastly, but it was big enough to be noticed by Joe from his seat on the couch. She had made no effort to hide it, may not have even been aware it was there, but as she headed upstairs, Joe headed down to the basement instead. He owed Bill an apology, it seemed. The weekend went by without much trouble. Joe spent most of it home by himself since Jessica went to stay with a friend and Debbie went on a girls' weekend with her friends. Friends, Joe thought as she kissed his cheek and walked out the door with her suitcase. Right. He believed that, as much as he believed that the hickey she had covered with makeup was a rash. By the time the two of them came back Sunday night, Joe was ready for Monday. He'd practiced a few times, a few of those times ending painfully, and as he slid back in through the basement window, he made no sound. He had eaten his breakfast that morning, kissed his wife goodbye, and left for work, just as he had 100 times before. Then he pulled into the parking lot of the Dunkin' Donuts about 3 blocks away and called his boss to tell him he wasn't feeling well and that he'd be taking the day off. His boss had understood, had told him he hoped he felt better, and Joe had slid his slacks off to reveal jogging pants underneath. His polo came off too, revealing a tight jogging shirt, and he added a hat and some sunglasses before leaving the car and jogging up the road. When he came to his house 30 minutes later, there was already a car in the driveway. It appeared she hadn't wasted any time. As he came slowly around the side of the house, he could see the two of them embracing in the living room. Debbie with her hands all over a dark-haired man, a little younger than Joe. Joe could have probably come right in through the front door without them noticing, and they worked their way upstairs as he made his way to the basement window. He couldn't believe she was doing something like this in the living room, with the curtains open nonetheless. Anyone could see her. He was in through the window in a matter of seconds, and no one in the house was the wiser. As he came to the head of the stairs, he reached down beside the banister and felt for what he had hidden there. Joe wasn't a violent man, but he understood the need for home defense. His father had owned this particular shotgun since Joe was a kid. When he died, Joe had taken it to his house. Debbie hadn't liked it, saying that Jessica might hurt herself with it, so Joe had always kept it in the basement. He had thought it was stupid then, but now he was glad that she hadn't let him put it in the bedroom closet like he'd wanted. It would have been harder to lay hands on there. "Good luck," Bill said from the model, and Joe nodded to him as he made his way quietly up the stairs. He could hear them as he came into the kitchen, but the basement door had been oiled, so it wouldn't give him away. They would never know how many times he had practiced this, how many times he had crept from the basement to the bedroom. This would definitely qualify as premeditated if he was caught, and any investigator worth his salt would be able to tell. Joe didn't care, though. Bill had already let him know that this was something a husband did when he loved his wife and needed to let her know her place. That place, Joe knew, would be in the backyard by the oak tree. There were clothes scattered around the living room, but nothing too intimate. A sock here, a pair of stockings here, a shirt thrown across the couch, a shoe by the door, and all in line towards the stairs. They'd been busy already, and Joe wondered what she would have done if he had forgotten something and had to come back. Joe realized that she knew him too well, though. He never forgot anything. Joe was meticulous, driven by his routine, and he would have no more forgotten something he needed than he would have left without his pants. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, listening to them as they did their cheating on the floor above. It was shameful. She'd never made noises like that for him, even when he had been interested in things like that. She had mostly just lain there, dutifully, but it sounded like she was being more than dutiful for him. He stopped again at the midpoint as the stair creaked a little, but they were making too much noise by then. They didn't even hear as he slid the door open, but when he cocked the shotgun and pointed it at the pair of them, Debbie screamed in something other than passion. The gun blammed before either of them could make their case, and Joe was left standing there in the aftermath. Joe came running into the basement, slamming the door behind him and throwing the lock. He could see the flashing lights from the basement window, and he knew that they'd be coming down the stairs any time now. His plan hadn't been quite as well planned as he had thought, and now it was all coming apart. He had stood there in the bedroom, looking over what he had done for several minutes before he heard sirens coming from up the street some. There was no way they had already been called about the gunshot. Less chance that they were close already. Someone had to have seen him go into the house. Someone who had then heard the shots while they were still on the phone with the emergency services. Now they had his number, and he was out of escape routes. Joe went to the model, looking down at Bill's house as he tried to find the old man. For one terrible second, he was worried that he wouldn't be there, that it would have all been a trick or a delusion, and that he had done all this for nothing. No cars moved on the street, no people walked between the buildings, and as the voice came from the floor above, Joe started to shake. "Bill! Bill, I need your help! The cops are after me, Bill!" No answer. Joe heard something heavy hit the front door, rattling the frame. "Bill! Bill!" Bill said nothing. The loud bang came again. "Bill!" Joe yelled, hearing something break upstairs as whatever they were hitting the door with broke the frame. "What's all the ruckus, hoss?" Joe looked down, seeing Bill as he stuck his head out of the window of the second story. His hair was standing in corkscrews, and he was rubbing his eyes sleepily. Bill looked as if Joe had awoken him from some deep sleep, and Joe wondered how anyone could sleep through something like that. Joe's heart was hammering like the cops on his door, and his blood pressure felt ready to send his heart out of his chest. "Bill, thank God! Listen, the cops are at the door. They're going to arrest me." "Oh," Bill said, leaning out the sill. "Well, that is a problem." The two were quiet for a moment, staring at each other, and Joe winced as he heard the door cave in under their blows and boots as they came into the foyer. "What do I do?" Joe asked. Bill said, the police upstairs telling Joe to come out with his hands up. "I suppose you could turn yourself in, let them know you caught your wife cheating, and just kind of snapped." Joe heard someone test the lock on the basement door before calling for help. "Or," Bill said, "you could always come live here." Joe looked surprised. You mean in Macklin?" "Sure. You know, we've been looking for a conductor for the railroad. You could live at the railway house, drive the trains, and never worry about anything ever again." Someone drove a boot into the basement door, and the lock shuddered. "How?" Joe asked. Bill extended a hand. "Come with me, Joe. Come away from all that and live with decent folks." Bill's whole hand wouldn't fit on the end of Joe's finger, but as he reached carefully towards him, the tingle that ran through him was worse than the most painful Charlie horse he had ever had. When he opened his eyes, however, he was face to face with the smiling old man. "Joe," Bill said, casting a hand out to the city, "welcome to Macklin." Jessica opened the basement door and looked down into the darkness. It had been 5 years since her mother's death and her father's disappearance, and Jessica hadn't been back since the day her grandparents had driven away from her childhood home. She was 22 now, about to leave for college, and was hoping to maybe get a little help with tuition after she sold the house. Everything else that her parents had owned had been sold and the money placed in trust for her, but she wasn't allowed to touch it until she was 25. Great. Thanks, Mom and Dad. That was really going to help her pay for college. Selling the house would more than get her what she needed, but Jessica hated coming back here. The house had remained untouched for the last 5 years. The locals thought it was haunted. Most of them also thought her dad was secretly living in it, and he had taken refuge in the walls after killing her mom. But if he had, then no one had ever found him. Everyone believed he had killed her mother, shot her and her lover in the bed that they had shared, and then made a clean escape. Jessica had mixed feelings about the situation, feelings that made grieving difficult when the wound was fresh. On the one hand, her mom had been cheating on her father, and that was bad. On the other, her father was such a cold and obtuse person that it was a wonder her mother hadn't cheated on him before that. She had known her father for her entire life and knew little about him, beside the fact that he liked trains. She couldn't remember a time when he had ever shown interest in something that she had liked, or even a time when he had just asked her about her day. It was sad when the most interesting thing about your father was that he might have killed your mother. The basement looked exactly the way she remembered it. The washer and the dryer still stacked with clean, unfolded clothes. The shelves still held a random assortment of things, and the train set still took up most of the floor space. Jessica grimaced. She would have to do something about it if she was going to sell the house. Some of those trains could even be worth money, she reflected. As if hearing her thoughts, something made an angry scutter across the tracks of the little town, and Jessica squeaked before retreating back up the stairs. Nuts to this, she would investigate the basement another day, maybe when Randy was free to help her. The basement had always been creepy to her, and that hadn't changed with time in the slightest. She slammed the door and went to look at the rest of the house, leaving the basement to its own devices. Joe felt the breeze as the diesel loco thundered down the tracks. He pulled the cord and listened to the whistle blow as he waved to the passers-by who had stopped to wait for the train. He couldn't remember anything before he had taken up the cap and overalls that made him the conductor of the Macklin line, but he was sure it hadn't been better than this. No wife, no kids, nothing but train times and passenger schedules. Sometimes when he wasn't driving the train, he sort of remembered someone from before he had come here. A woman and a girl, a house, a boring job, a boring life, but none of that really mattered. Joe was happy, happier than he had ever been, and as he drove past Bill's house, he waved to his old friend as he sat whistling on the porch. They would have some beers later, Millie cooking them another wonderful dinner, and then Joe would wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. Yes, sir, Macklin was the best little town in the whole damn world. You're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story? Or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstad and Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Saikat, Ronda J, and Sue Casper for being our spooky skeleton contributors. And thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Sarah ASMR42, and Bella Lee for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks everyone so much. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. For just $5 a month, you get your stories 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. Also, if you'd like to join our Ghostly Reader contributor tier over on Patreon, you get a book anytime I write one on your doorstep, as long as you live in the continental U.S., of course. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.